For the next half an hour, we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, Research Director at the Perth USA Asia Centre. For those of you that have not heard of the centre, it's based at UWA here in Perth. It's a not-for-profit institution which aims at strengthening relationships and strategic thinking between Australia, Indo-Pacific and the US. The centre is a leading think tank focusing on geopolitical issues and policy development. Jeff specialises in regional economic integration of the Indo-Pacific. In particular, his expertise in the politics of trade agreements, regional economic institutions and Australia's economic ties with Asia. So given the trade environment we've experienced over the last year, we've engaged with Jeff quite a bit and we thought it would be really great to share those insights with you today. And what he's going to be covering today is the global political environment, international trade outlook for the WA grain industry, and implications for the Joe Biden presidency. So it'll be very interesting. So welcome, Jeff, to the stage. Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much, Brianna. And look, thanks to everyone here. It's really my pleasure to speak to the CBH growers regarding what I think is a really critical issue that's dominated the grains discussion in the last year, which are some of the political headwinds that have been facing Australia's agricultural exporters. From the perspective of the international political side of the equation, the reality was that 2020 was one of the toughest years for the Australian ag sector in a long time. It started with a US-China trade deal that threatened to potentially displace billions of Australian exports from our number one market. Coronavirus just a few months after that, which many of you would know posed complex challenges on both the import and export sides. And then in May, the Chinese government unleashed a trade bashing campaign against Australia of a real unprecedented scale. By the end of the year, 13 Australian industries, predominantly but not exclusively in agriculture, had been affected by Chinese trade sanctions or threats of some sort. And so what I was hoping to do in today's presentation was to take stock of where the sector sits with respect to these political headwinds. We'll talk about what happened in 2020, to whom, explain how these political issues are part of a broader and global international political context, and think about what the next steps will be for managing these problems into 2021 and beyond. So in recent years, the story of Australian ag exports has in large part been a story about China. After 4 decades of high-speed growth, China's developed a sizable middle class with an appetite for food in a quality and quantity that simply isn't available from its domestic industry. And as China became a net food importer, Australia found itself in the box seat to supply this booming market. Of course, the Australia-China ag trade was well established going back several decades. But as we've got on this chart, it's really in the last 10 years since 2009 that the bilateral trade really took off. In the decade to 2019, Australian ag exports to China increased fivefold from $3.5 to $17 billion a year. And interestingly, 2/3 of all agricultural export growth during that period can be attributed to additional Chinese demand. The share of national exports, ag exports going to China also tripled from 11 to 32%, which has made China Australia's top export market. Indeed, it towers over Japan, the second largest export market, which is only at 12% of the total. Interestingly, it appears that the effective chapter, the bilateral FTA, which does contain many market opening provisions for agriculture, wasn't the principal driver of this China boom. As the data shows, there's been a fairly steady trend of about 15% year-on-year export growth in dollar terms since 2009, and that trend wasn't meaningfully changed when Chapter entered into force in 2016. So fundamentally, Australian agriculture has a China market because businesses in the sector got in and developed it first. The FTA followed, and all that was doing was simply supporting a trend that had been established by businesses like CBH years before. Unfortunately, that story of steady growth came to a sudden end last year. Due to a number of factors, the political relationship between the Australian and Chinese governments deteriorated dramatically in the first half of 2020. And while there's certainly been tensions before, what was new this time was China's use of trade sanctions against Australia to make its diplomatic displeasure clear. Sanctions began in May when massive anti-dumping and countervailing duties were applied to Australian barley, effectively pricing it out to the Chinese market. More sectors then followed. Beef was hit with export licence suspensions in Queensland, wine was hit with its own anti-dumping duties, Cotton had its TRQ privileges revoked, and in October, Australian coal was banned from the Chinese market entirely. And so by the end of the year, 13 exports had been affected in some kind of sanction. Now, the scale of these sanctions, when you measure them in dollar terms, is really unprecedented. In 2019, the last year for which we've got really good complete data, these 13 sectors exported 54 billion Australian dollars to China, and that accounts for about a tenth of Australia's national all-sector exports. As you can also see from this graphic, unfortunately it's been the farm sector that's borne the brunt of China's trade fury. 9 of the 13 affected commodities are farm products, and dairy and horticulture are really the only major ag subsectors that have been entirely unaffected. By contrast, China has not sanctioned most of Australia's main mineral exports, things like iron ore, gas or bauxite, because these are essential to China's industrial needs. Now, it goes without saying that $54 billion of trade sanctions is a serious problem. But the effect of these sanctions has in some cases been amplified by our level of dependence on the Chinese market. As this chart shows, Chinese export dependence varies considerably across the agriculture sector. It runs at 32% for the sector as a whole, but for a number of products, particularly wool, wine, processed foods, cotton, forestry, crustaceans and barley, China accounts for the majority of exports, well over half. And so this means that China isn't just a customer, but for some parts of the ag sector is now become the customer. And this high level of single market dependence magnifies the effects of external political risks. When an issue arises, such as last year's sanctions, they carry an outside effect on the exposed industries. I think everyone in this room will be familiar with the Herculean effort required from CBH to place this year's barley in alternate markets on a very short time frame. Spare a thought for WA's rock lobster fishers, who lack an alternate domestic or international markets to pivot towards, because for them the impact has been even worse. Now, the big political question I'm asked by friends in the sector is, why us and why now? The unfortunate reality is that this has nothing to do with Australian farmers and everything to do with broader global geopolitics. It's fair to say that Australia-China government relations have been on a downward trajectory for at least 5 years now. This began when China, under the new leadership of Xi Jinping, began adopting a far more aggressive approach to foreign policy, and Australia joined with several other countries in criticising this aggressive behaviour. From an Australian perspective, we have a laundry list of concerns regarding China's recent political behaviour. These include the militarisation of the South China Sea, incessant foreign interference and cyber attacks against Australia, chequebook diplomacy throughout the Pacific Islands, the legal annexure of Hong Kong, and gross human rights abuses in places such as Xinjiang, where cotton is produced by forced labour. Successive Australian governments, not simply the current one, have not shied away from drawing attention to these issues. But for their part, the Chinese government's extremely upset as Australia as well. We happen to know why, because the Chinese embassy helpfully leaked a list of 14 grievances with Australia to the Australian media last year. They consider Australia to be a proxy of the United States, and that when we criticise these behaviours, we are guilty of an anti-China outlook. They're upset at our laws designed to protect national security against foreign interference, and angry that we've excluded Huawei, a Chinese telecoms company, from our NBN and 5G networks. So if that's the why, then what about the why now? While all of these issues have been around for some time, they came to a head last year due to the coronavirus pandemic. When Australia made a call for an independent inquiry into the origins of coronavirus in April, it unleashed a diplomatic rage in China, frankly never seen before. The fact that 130 other countries, including ultimately China itself, agreed to this inquiry made little difference. A scapegoat was needed, and as Australia was already in the doghouse, made an obvious target. What this does mean, though, is that the coronavirus inquiry issue was not the cause of what has happened. It was really just the straw that broke what I'd argue was an already overloaded camel's back. But if we're going to really properly understand this issue, we need to put the Australia-China trade issues into a wider international political context. And if we do so, three things become apparent. The first is that Australia is far from alone in having to deal with Chinese trade sanctions. In the last few years, China's become a frequent user of trade sanctions to attack others. As this table shows, seven other countries have been on the receiving end of this, often for what I would consider fairly trivial infractions. Japan had its supply of rare earth minerals cut off when its Coast Guard arrested an illegal Chinese fishing boat. Norwegian salmon was banned from China when the Nobel Prize Committee, which is entirely independent of the Norwegian government, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident. Taiwan's mistake in 2016 was to hold a democratic election that didn't deliver China's preferred candidate to the presidency. So Australia is the 8th country to go through this experience, and the threshold for being targeted is surprisingly low. Second, these Chinese trade sanctions are actually a part of a worldwide trend towards protectionism in agriculture. And in the last decade, many governments around the world have been erecting new barriers to trade in farm goods. These take a variety of forms, such as high levels of subsidies in the US and Europe, tariffs and quotas in India, or even export controls like we've seen from Russia in cereals in recent months. And on this chart, I've extracted the data for all trade policy interventions in the global cereals market specifically since 2009. Unfortunately, the numbers make sobering reading. During this period, governments around the world have erected 660 new barriers to cereals trade, while liberalising that trade only 379 times. So it's roughly a 2-to-1 ratio. And with the economic stresses caused by coronavirus last year, 2020 was unfortunately a high water mark for cereals protectionism, with 84 new barriers erected in 2020 alone. This demonstrates that the political challenge for grains exporters are not only a China issue, but also reflect a broader global trend towards protectionism we're going to need to contend with in the future. Third, there's also challenges posed for Australia by the US-China trade war. In 2018, US President Donald Trump started a trade war with China that quickly spiralled to become one of the world's worst trade wars fought in over a century. After tariffs affecting an astonishing $700 billion were exchanged between the two sides, they brokered a ceasefire agreement around Christmas time in 2019. It was officially called the US-China Phase 1 Trade Agreement, though it was actually a Chinese agreement to purchase an astonishingly large amount of US goods. Agriculture featured prominently in this deal, with China agreeing to purchase an additional $80 billion of US farm products over the next 2 years, 2020 and 2021. But to get all of that US ag into the Chinese market, the Chinese government also agreed to liberalise a number of the agricultural trade regulations in China for US exporters and US exporters alone. We've got these ones up in the box here on this slide, and what this shows is that rules for beef, pork, poultry, meat, dairy, seafood and cereals trade have all been changed to provide preferential and fast-track access for a US exporter. This is a major threat to the Australian ag sector because it places our exporters at a disadvantage relative to their US competitors in the Chinese market. And what it also demonstrates is that even when Australia is a neutral bystander to a political fight, our trade can still be affected by the trade warfare of others. So how are we responding to these political headwinds? And the short answer is agricultural export diversification. If market concentration magnifies the effect of risks, equally diversity builds shock resilience. And whatever the source of the risk, China, global, US, having a greater range of markets provides exporters an insurance policy for when things go wrong. We're seeing this in two levels. At the business level, we're already seeing this diversification agenda gathering steam. CBH responded to the Chinese tariffs by placing barley in alternate markets, such as the Middle East. Coal exporters in New South Wales and Queensland developed a new trade relationship with India to take the product that had been displaced from the Chinese market. And even wine producers have doubled down on their marketing efforts, both in some of their existing markets, such as the US and UK, as well as new markets that they're opening for the first time throughout Southeast Asia. The government's also behind this as well. In December, Agricultural Minister Littleproud, featured here, announced a $73 million agribusiness expansion initiative in which market diversification featured very prominently. New program commitments through Austrade and the department are being implemented to help identify new export niches for Australia and then support businesses, particularly but not only small and medium enterprises, to build the capacity needed to take advantage of them. Now, to be sure, diversification is not an easy or quick fix, and in the short run, it's not necessarily going to achieve the volumes or the prices that we've become used to in established markets. No one's suggesting that diversification alone can solve these political problems overnight. But we would argue that it's essential in the long run to ensure that we have enough resilience to manage these political headwinds when they blow again. Nor, however, are we simply walking away from the China issue. As many of you will be familiar, in December last year, the Australian government formally referred China's tariffs on barley to the World Trade Organisation's dispute settlement mechanism. This dispute, which has been given the case number DS598, is going to be heard in Geneva this year. Now, the Australian legal case is very complex and actually alleges that China's application of anti-dumping duties to Australian barley violates 26 different WTO legal principles. But the nub of the case comes down to how China supposedly calculated whether Australia dumps barley, i.e. sells it below normal cost, into the Chinese market. I think it probably goes without saying in this room that Australia does not dump cereals exports in China or anywhere. And the good news is that this means Australia is quite likely to win this case on points of law. The method that the Chinese government used for calculating the dumping margin is spurious, does not conform to established principles of international trade law, and will be found as such by a WTO expert panel. However, WTO cases are notoriously complex to litigate, and so an outcome is going to take time. At a minimum, one should normally expect 12 to 15 months for the process, but due to a recent backlog of cases at the WTO, it is realistically going to take longer. This means that DS598 will not provide relief in time for this year's or probably next year's harvests either. And we also need to remember that this only contests anti-dumping duties on barley, so it's not going to solve the broader political challenges in the China market. Particularly difficult is going to be the arbitrary application of sanitary and phytosanitary or SPS bans, which we've recently seen applied to timber and lobsters. These SPS bans are notoriously opaque and are very difficult to evidence at a standard required for successful litigation. So while the WTO action is an important part of the national toolkit, and I believe the right thing to do, it's also not going to be a panacea for the issues facing the sector today. A wildcard factor that might change the game is the recent election of the Biden administration in the US. While President Trump was willfully destructive to the global trade system, Biden promises a new and more constructive approach that could lessen some of the political challenges I've previously outlined. On the positive side, Biden has signalled a commitment to global rules, global institutions and alliances that Trump explicitly sought to destroy. This includes the rules-based system on which Australian ag exporters depend. That's good. The administration's also signalled that it stands, and I quote here, shoulder to shoulder with Australia in the trade disputes with China. Politically, this will deter China from escalating the conflict further than it already has. And the US has also begun restoring some functions at the WTO which had been deliberately suspended by the Trump administration. That's important because it ensures that the barley case has the best chance for a quick and effective success. I'd also argue that we need to be realistic, however, about how much this new US approach is going to be able to do for us. The fact is that America is now in a deep political and economic crisis, and the new administration inherits a complex and overloaded agenda at home. While restoring the global trade system is definitely one of their declared priorities, in the era of the coronavirus pandemic, it's clearly not going to be their number one priority on day one in office. We have also seen some protectionist tendencies, such as the recent Buy American government procurement policy come out of the White House. And Biden has indicated that the US is going to continue its strategic rivalry with China, which means that we shouldn't expect Australia-China political ties to dramatically improve in the short term. To finish off today, let me just share our outlook at the Perth US Asia Centre for these Australia-China political issues in 2021, but also probably beyond. And we'd argue that bilateral ties could be best described as in a stalemate and likely to remain that way for some time. On the upside, it looks like the trajectory we saw between May and November last year has come to an end. China's mostly ceased escalating its trade bashing against Australia and not applied any new sanctions for 19 weeks now, until this morning's issue regarding Queensland reef fish happened. So we might be back to day zero. There needs to be some more clarification around the SPS ban on a Queensland reef fish exporter. We've also seen that some of the inflammatory anti-Australian propaganda that was really aggressively pushed out by Chinese state media last year has now slowed to a trickle. And earlier this year, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce allowed the tariff rate quota allocations for beef, cotton and wool to index upwards normally per the agreed standards in the bilateral FTA. So in other words, we're no longer on a downward course. But the problem is there's no easy way to get back on an upwards trajectory either, due to some remaining and probably intractable political issues. The fundamental reality is that no Australian government will withdraw from positions of core importance to our national interest and security, such as militarisation of the South China Sea or foreign interference and cyber attacks. And equally, China's now committed itself to a full court press of trade intimidation against Australia, which it can't walk away from without getting some form of concession. Unfortunately, a recent attempt by new Trade Minister Dan Tehan to hold even talks on China on these issues didn't receive a reply. And without talks, there's little scope for a negotiated settlement. So for the time being, Australia and China probably at the government level find themselves in a political stalemate with no straightforward way forwards. And this means the diversification agenda that was front and centre in 2020 needs to remain that way for the sector in 2021 and beyond. Just to conclude, Australia's trade interests are being buffeted by geopolitical headwinds, and these are including but not limited to what the industry faced with China last year. These political challenges are global in scope and unfortunately not something we can fix on our own. But we can put ourselves in the best position to weather these political storms when they occur in the future, and diversification is essential to ensuring we have the breadth and resilience in our trade ties to manage these risks when they arise. Thanks. Excellent. Fortunately, I have about 7 minutes left for some question time, so if anyone had anything they'd like to ask while I'm up.
Thank you. Frank Panizza from 2J. China recently had a trade deal with New Zealand that appeared to be directly trying to create some division between Australia and New Zealand. Could you comment, please?
Certainly. Some of you may be aware that New Zealand had a free trade agreement with China some years before ours in 2016. Significantly, it was mostly significant for the dairy sector, particularly in Victoria, where Kiwi products had market access to China on preferential terms over the top of Australia, which was then neutralised by our free trade agreement with China in 2016. Since that time, New Zealand's been negotiating what they called an upgrade of their free trade agreement with China, and a few weeks ago this went through and was signed. There was certainly a lot of noise in the media and in some diplomatic circles where the Kiwi Trade Minister made some comments about how New Zealand was getting China right and Australia was getting China wrong, which resulted in what was widely reported as an apology call to his Australian counterpart. Look, the issue with that free trade agreement is the gain for New Zealand is actually extremely thin. The principal feature of that upgraded agreement is additional market access for 34 million New Zealand dollars of forestry products. It's certainly not anything that's affecting the cereals sector, and in the scheme of things, that upgrade was relatively thin. It's not If you're looking at market displacement problems, such as what the US-China trade deal did, there's not really going to be a major effect for Australian exporters from that. It's mostly political noise. Cheers.
Just related to the US agreement with China, Mick Felsmith, by the way. How long-lasting was the agreement that Donald Trump thrashed out with the Chinese, which has clearly sort of been strongly detrimental to us? How long-lasting is that, and is there any chance of sort of any winding back under the new administration?
Cheers, that's a really excellent question. So there's two components to the agreement. One was a Chinese promise to buy above and beyond, so that they used 2017 as the baseline year, and they were going to buy over 2 years for $80 billion more ag products. That's just a 2-year deal. So that finishes at the end of this year. What was more significant was, I'll just flick it back for you. The thing that's the long-term issue are these changes to China's trade policies. This is things about how you get beef into the country, accepting certificates from the US Department of Agriculture. So concretely, there's an agreement that USDA certificates will now be automatically accepted at Chinese ports. You won't have to go through the process of getting a Chinese certificate for your shipment. I know that's not always a significant issue for the cereals sector, but for many producers, particularly in beef, that's a big deal. These commitments are forever. And so even though that will buy an additional $80 billion in 2 years, has got a clock on it, and then it has to be renegotiated, these ones are a lasting regulatory fast track that US exporters are going to have over everybody else. So we live with this afterwards. In terms of what is going to happen after the end of this year, the phase 1 deal in terms of that promise to buy additional products was a complete failure. They were supposed to go an extra 30% over 2017 numbers and actually fell 30% under last year. A lot of that was to do with issues around the coronavirus pandemic. There's freight and logistics issues. Some of you might be aware in the US industry, they use a lot of casual labour and often migrant labour from other states which simply couldn't get in to pick crops. So the US farm sector just couldn't pump out enough food to actually sell to China was the problem we had this year. And the Biden administration is going to face an issue where, with this thing running out at the end of 2021, well, what do we do next? It's hard to say because they haven't given a direct indication, but I'd give you this insight on how to think about it. That US-China trade deal was really about Donald Trump. Much of it was about getting additional market access for parts of the American society that voted for him, particularly you would have seen stuff around soybeans in Wisconsin. Whereas for the Biden administration, they're going to take a more national interest view that's going to focus on a number of things that probably aren't, in which agriculture features less prominently, stuff about critical technologies, military technologies, energy, things like that. I think it's likely that you're going to see continued US-China trade war, but with Biden now in the office and not focused heavily on agriculture for Rust Belt states, it's probably likely when we get a phase 2 deal, or we call it a phase 1 Mark B, or whatever they mark Biden, that it's not going to feature agriculture in the way that Donald Trump's deal did, simply because of what his electoral and political interests were. Sure. Yep, that's it. Thank you, everybody. Cheers.